This video will give you everything you'll need for applying to medical school in terms of the interview process. Trust me, there's going to be a lot of detail in this video and you don't want to miss out. I'm going to be talking about the specific interviews that I did myself in detail and how you can learn from them and so do the best you can for your own interviews. So if you don't know who I am Nouman. I'm a first year medical student in UCL and I applied for 3 MMI universities. So that was UCL, Exitor and St. George's, and I managed to get offers from all 3 of those unis. So a lot of these tips are going to be personal to me and what I did to end up getting into these universities, and I really hope that you benefit from them. I'm going to try and stick to the point and make sure that I don't waffle too much. And this is in fact a part 2 of my previous video, one where I talked about the application process and how you write your personal statement and your work experience and things. So if you haven't checked that out as well after this video. But right now I think you guys probably have interviews coming up very soon. In fact, for me, I had my first interview from St. George's in December, so you've clicked on this video for some tips on those interviews, and don't worry, I'm going to make sure that I deliver. So without wasting your time, let's just get straight into my first tip. My first tip that I have for you guys is that in these interviews, you're trying to show that you're a good doctor. You're not trying to show how much you've done to be in this position. So with each and every question, you're trying to link everything you're talking about back to the reason why you're going to become a good doctor. Because when you think about it, this interview is pretty much a job interview. You're trying to show these recruiters that you're fit for the job. If you don't know exactly what you need to be fit for the job, there's a specific list of attributes that as a doctor are really important. And you've probably heard of these terms before, whether it's empathy, communication, teamwork, leadership. All of these terms are so common, and I talked about this in my previous video as well. You're always trying to buzz out these words and you're always trying to show exactly how you demonstrate these skills. So whether it's in your personal statement or now whether it's in your interview, you're really trying to demonstrate these skills, and a lot of the times the questions are going to try and force those skills out of you. So what I'm trying to say is that whenever you can, try and show that you're able to do these skills. So whenever they ask you about a specific experience, you're always trying to show that you demonstrated these skills in some sort of way, and don't be scared to mention it. Don't be scared to say, this is how I showed empathy. And then the really important part as well is when you're talking about empathy or when you're talking about communication or whatever you're talking about, you're then going to try and link it to why a doctor needs good empathy or why a doctor needs good communication. And the more knowledge you have on the role of a doctor and the way they work within the MDT, so that's the multidisciplinary team, the better you'll sound to the examiner. So you really want to try research these things beforehand, especially when you get asked about this. I'll talk a bit more about that in detail. I did get a question myself where I had to state some members of the MDT and how they work together effectively in a team. Even if you don't get asked about it, you should bring it up yourself. It just shows that you have that knowledge and it shows that you know how doctors work well in a team. And if you have experience to back it up as well, even better. I do want to touch on experience. A lot of people that you might talk to, perhaps yourself, probably have done experience where you've worked in a hospital, you've volunteered at a care home, whatever it could be. Don't be scared that your experience is not enough. Okay, that's one thing I really want to get out. You don't need to have any specific type of experience to become a doctor, right? Right now, you just need to show any type of experience that can make you fit to be the role of a doctor. So you don't have to have worked in a hospital. You didn't have to have shadowed someone. In fact, I myself, when I did these interviews and when I did these questions and everything, I didn't have anything. Nearly every single one of these stations, the thing I talked about most was my work. So I've had a part-time job for the past 2 years or so, and most of the time when they asked me about a stressful situation, for example, or where they asked me about a time where I worked well in a team, I just talked about my work. I talked about how I dealt with different people and different colleagues, and that allowed me to work well in a team and how that's going to be good for the role of a doctor, right? You don't have to have specifically linked experience to the hospital or to a care home or to some sort of volunteering place. You don't need to have any specific type of experience. So don't be dissuaded. Don't think that because you have good experience, you're more likely to get the place, and don't think that because you don't have good experience, you're less likely to get the place, if you get what I mean. Because I talked more about my work in all of these interviews than my more like clinical work experience. So I also was a cadet in St. John's Ambulance. I didn't mention that much compared to my work, which I mentioned in nearly every single one of my stations, just because I had so many experiences that I could remember from my work that I could link into these. And now, speaking of experiences and speaking of things to say, it's really important to have a list of things beforehand. So go through all the different attributes, so empathy, communication, leadership, whatever it is, right? And think about an experience in your life that have led you to demonstrate these skills, right? And make a document of all these experiences, just because that way it makes it so much easier. You don't have to sit there thinking of everything as you go. You've already got a set experience in your head, and then you can link that to whatever the question is. So if the question is something to do with empathy and you already have a few experiences that you remember from your work or from your shadowing or from your volunteering based on empathy, then it's so much easier to put in. And that's also a really good other thing as well. Remember that in an MMI, you can repeat the same thing in every single station if you really wanted to, and just tweak it a little to make it suit the question question. Now that being said, don't just memorize one set thing and put it to every station, right? But if you have something that's really good that you can also apply in another station, by all means go for it, right? Because each station is a new station. Each person doesn't know about the person before. So if you can put something in, please do put it in if it's good for the question. This leads me on to a very important point which people don't really talk that much about, and this is to think before you speak. You do not have much time within these MMI interviews, but one thing I do recommend for you to do is to take a few seconds beforehand, just think about what you're going to say and then start speaking. It's so much better to, once they've asked you the question, to just sit there for a bit and just contemplate what you're going to say and how you're going to link it together, than to just go straight on and start speaking, and then to start thinking as you're speaking and just adding more and more on, right? Because what would happen is you might backtrack and be like, oh wait, I forgot to add something beforehand. I don't know if you hear that, but there's currently a canary just zooming around this room, so just to apologize if that's a bit annoying. The point is, you're trying to give a really concise answer that has everything you need to say, but that doesn't have things you don't need to say. So what I'm trying to say is don't waffle, because a lot of the times you might realize that you finished your answer and you still have like a minute to go. Don't just decide, oh, I have a minute to go, let me just continue speaking and make the most out of my time. You don't have to do that. If you think that your answer is enough, leave it at that and you'll be fine. Thinking back to my interviews, the majority of them I finished before the station ended. But the thing is, in each and every station, I felt like I had said everything I had needed to have said for that station, and so it didn't feel like I had more to say, and that was purely because I thought about each and every answer before I started speaking. In about, I think there was probably only 1 or 2 stations on my entire interview process where I just went straight on with the question just because I knew what to say instantly. Oh, there, did you see it just go through? It doesn't know when to let me speak. But trust me, think about what you're going to say and then say it. So when the interviewer asks you a question, just be like, is it alright if I think about this for a second? And they'll be more than happy, and then begin your answer. Not only is it good for you, right, but it's also good for the interviewer, because it makes them know that you're actually thinking about what you're going to say and you're not running straight into the question. Because a lot of the times you want to look at the question for a second time to make sure that you haven't misunderstood something. No matter how good your answer is, no matter how good your answer is, if you misinterpreted the question, you're not going to do well just because you didn't answer the question correctly. So there's a lot of times where a question might have 2 points that you have to mention both of them for you to get a decent score in it. And if you had just completely neglected the second point because you didn't think it through, then a long day, right? You want to make sure that you have the best of chances. So you really want to think about, oh, there's 2 parts in this question. Let me spend this amount of time talking about this part, and then I'll spend this amount of time talking about the other part, right? This is all things that you do right before you start speaking. So that's my second tip. Think before you speak. It's so important, but it's something that people don't talk enough about. Now, in terms of actually preparing for this, okay, so let's say you have your interview in a few weeks' time. How do you begin preparing? Now, my very first thing to say is that look at the uni that's giving that interview, because different unis have different things that they usually ask within their MMI interviews, or if it's a panel interview, even though I'm focusing more on MMI interviews in this video, just because that's what I have expertise in. There's a lot of websites you can find online which can give you past interview questions from that specific university, or the type of questions that they usually like to give. So I'll talk a bit more in detail about the unis that I applied for and the type of questions they gave me. So if you have an interview in a few weeks' time, first thing you want to do is really just look at their kind of questions that they like to give, right? But don't just use that as your benchmark. Still make sure that you revise for MMI as a whole. And when you're revising for your MMI, the way you do it is you look at each and every section separately. So each station, you want to make sure you're strong at each and every one by itself. And the way to practice these stations, the way I did it, was to use a friend. So I would, in the evenings, I would have me and my friend, sometimes even a couple of friends, on a meeting, right, on a Google Meet, and we'd just ask each other questions, and then we'd give each other answers and how they did, and give them feedback and things like that. It's much easier to assess someone else's answer as they're speaking than for you yourself to assess your own answer, right? Because you can be biased towards yourself when you can have a specific way that you'd like to answer it. If you hear it from someone else's perspective, even if you hear someone else answering a question that you want to answer, you can hear the way their thought process works, and you might steal a thing or two from theirs because it's much better than yours, for example. It's so effective to practice with friends. I mean, that's obvious, right? But make sure most of your interview prep is with friends and is with someone in front of you. You want to be giving your interview answers in front of an actual person, just like how you're going to be doing in your interview yourself. And then I like to use ChatGPT a lot as well, because it can give lots of good points, and like it can make a checklist for you in terms of what you should say for each question. Now, obviously it's not perfect, but it's a good way to generate questions and generate answers for those questions and generate talking points within those questions. So I use ChatGPT a lot for my revision and for my interview preparation. I really recommend that you guys do as well. It's a really good resource. So in terms of general tips for these interviews, firstly, really try and show that you're going to be a good doctor. So try and always talk about the role of a doctor however you can. You're always trying to show that the skills that you've learned is going to make you a good doctor because of those skills and how those skills translate into being a good doctor. The second thing I said was to think before you speak. This will give you composure and this will make you have very good, concise, detailed answers. I'm also going to couple this one now as well with have a water bottle with you, right? Between each station, you want to really make sure that you're hydrated. And drinking water, I don't know why, for me at least, it just helped in resetting my mind a little, bringing myself to like forget about the previous station and move on to the next one. Whether I was happy with the previous station or whether I wasn't, you really want to just put that one to the side and now focus on an entirely new one. And my third and last tip was to practice as much with your friends as you can, and then to use ChatGPT as well to assist you. That's pretty self-explanatory, but it's something that is so important, and you really want to take advantage of any people who are applying to the same unis as you, for example, but just generally who are applying for medicine just like you, because those people are the ones that can really understand what you're going through at this point. Alright, time for the last section of this video. I'm going to start off with St. George's and Exeter, the two ones that I got an offer for but I didn't accept, and then I'll talk in a lot more detail about UCL and specifically what went down in that interview. In terms of St. George's, all the questions I got were very similar. They were all very much, they gave me a scenario originally, and then I had to show my thoughts on that scenario and how I deal with that scenario. And then a lot of the times they would give a second part to it saying, why did you think we asked you this question? So for example, one of the questions that I got asked was about an experience at work, volunteering work experience, where I had to demonstrate skills that are found within the healthcare setting. This is such a common question, and this is something that even if you don't explicitly get asked, you're going to be answering indirectly. In terms of these type of questions, you always want to make sure that you don't go overboard with the amount of skills you talk about, okay? Because there's so many. Don't talk about every single one. Focus on maybe 2 or 3 max, right? So talk about empathy, talk about communication, talk about leadership, talk about teamwork, talk about honesty, talk about integrity, talk about dignity, talk about all these words, but don't try and shove them all into one interview. Don't just shove them all into one station. Focus on some of them specifically and really show how you demonstrated those skills and then how those skills transfer into the healthcare setting. Another thing I want to say about the St. George's interview is that I did also get a role play scenario, and this is the only role play scenario I got across my interviews, and it was, I think, probably one of my worst stations, to be honest, because I started tweaking a little, especially when the patient got a little angry with me. I didn't really know how to respond, but it's really important to stay calm in these situations, to try and always show as much respect as you can and to try and not lose composure. That's the most important thing. Even if something goes wrong, which I would say quite a few things did within the station, don't get angry, don't lose hope, just continue doing things how you did when you're practicing, and hopefully you can get a decent score out of it. Because remember, even if one station doesn't go too well, if the other ones go well, then you'll still get in, so it's alright, don't worry. But in terms of the MMI stations at St. George's, there's no curveball-y type questions. There's nothing in there that really confused me or made me think, oh, how am I going to answer this? All of the questions were very much questions that I've seen before in some sort of way. I can't even remember most of them, but I do remember that they were not hard questions. They were questions that you've probably seen before, but it's just important to make sure that you can give concise, detailed answers for these questions without waffling too much and without skipping some of the really important points, which is talking about those skills and talking about how it correlates with being a doctor and how it's important as a medical student to employ as well, for example, because that can be important too. There's some skills that you need to know as a medical student and some skills that you need to know as a doctor, and most of the time they're transferable, but there's some skills that are even more important as a medical student or even more important as a doctor. So it's really important to have that distinction, to know what you're talking about and to never be waffling within these. Now the Exitor one, for me, I had online, whereas the St. George's one was in person. I barely remember anything about this interview. It was very forgettable, but what I do remember is it felt very much like St. George's in terms of all the questions were very, I guess, basic, as in like questions I've seen before. That's why I'm saying not anything very curveball-y. And the way Exeter did their questions was that each station would have multiple questions, sometimes 3-4 questions, based on that one specific topic. So you didn't have to answer all of those questions, but each time you'd run out of things to say from from one, or like you're done with speaking about one question, it would move on to the next one. So you don't have to worry about not answering all the questions, but it's just there's most of the time you don't actually know how many questions there could have been within that station, just because each time you finish your answer with one, they move on to the next one. I honestly found this one easier than St. George's, just because a lot of the questions, once again, were things that I've literally been asked before when I've been doing questions, and things that I've seen before. There wasn't very many things. The only one that kind of tripped me out a tiny bit was that when they asked me about why I wanted to go to Exitor, they also asked me about what things about the location really made me want to go, and I didn't really know much about the location of Exitor, so I kind of had to just try my best for that question. I don't really know if I did well, but yeah, that's the only thing I really remember from it that just kind of confused me a little. But everything was fine for that. So if you're applying for Exitor, you'll be fine. It's all chill. Now, UCL, this is my uni. So this is the one I have quite a bit to talk about. I won't go into the details of every single question. I might make an entire video on this one, to be honest, if I have the time, to be honest. But the UCL interview felt very more technical than the other interviews that I'd done. So with the other interviews, it was very much like, tell me about a time where this, or tell me about a time where you did this, right? This one felt more like they were trying to get specific things out of me. So for example, I got asked about, like, things to do with confidentiality, consent, that kind of thing. I got asked heavily about that in one station. That was a very important thing. And the thing about the UCL interviews, if you don't know as well, is that they can give follow-up questions. So even though the station question might be one thing, if you finish talking about that, they can further ask you more questions based on what you've said yourself. And so sometimes that can be really difficult and can really throw you off, but you really need to make sure you stay cool with these type of questions. So this interview genuinely felt much more difficult than the other two, just because of this one aspect. And for my MMI, they do tell you beforehand as well. They did ask me about my personal statement. They had my personal statement in front of them, and they highlighted an area which they asked me about. That was fine. It's not that bad. Just make sure that if any interviewer is asking you about your personal statement, to really know your personal statement in and out. What I did myself was I looked at my personal statement, and any parts where I could think they would ask me follow-up questions for, I made a little response for it. And so that way I didn't have to worry about things I might have to say based on my personal statement, because I had pretty much figured out everything they could have asked me. And so it wasn't too hard, to be honest. As long as you're prepared and you know your personal statement well, this station should be fine. I think the most challenging station within this for me was a station where they asked me about any sort of medical advancements that I've researched on or I've read about. Now, luckily, I have done a research project based on Alzheimer's and dementia, and that really helped me within the station. And genuinely, there's something about this interview process, the UCL interview process, that was so much more enjoyable than the other ones, because when I would be talking, they genuinely sounded interesting in what I was saying, and they were asking me more questions about it. Whereas the other interviewers, they were just typing away and they didn't care about what I was saying. They were just scribbling their notes on whatever they were doing, who knows. I felt like I was talking to a wall in those ones. These ones, it genuinely felt like I was sitting next to someone who was interested in me and who wanted to know more about me, so they could see if I'm a viable candidate. Specifically within this one, you have to either know something or you don't, right? So this is really important. Make sure you do some further reading and have a bit of idea of like the recent medical things that are going on. Look at the news a bit, try and be quite aware. You don't have to focus too much on this, but have something in mind in case they do ask about any sort of research project or anything that you've read upon or anything that you've watched. Have something in mind for that. Might be the difference between you getting in and you not getting in. So I would recommend you do something like that. There was a lot of dilemmas within this interview, and I can't remember them exactly, but I just remember that they did kind of get me a bit confused at times. But remember that if you're ever lost, it's all right to say, can I just get a few moments to think about this, okay? Don't just give an answer and dig yourself into a hole that you can't get out of. Think about everything they ask you and really take your time when you're answering these questions. I had to do that a lot for some of my stations, and it's perfectly okay. They understand. They know that this is the first time you've seen this question, and so they know that you need some time to think about it, and that's perfectly fine, so don't worry. Also within this interview got a question of analyzing a graph. So I mean, it shouldn't be too bad, right? You should be fine with this type of question, but make sure you do some graph analysis, do some data analysis generally, because that can be really important. And what they did within the station is, before I went in, the graph was there. They asked me some questions based upon that graph. So really be good and familiar with recognizing trends, being able to describe certain data and things like that. That's also an important thing, especially within this interview that I found. And I think generally what my biggest takeaway from this type of interview, so the UCL interview, is to show that you're interested, to show that you really want to become a doctor, to show that you have what it takes to become one. And I think if you do that, you show that you're someone who has these skills that are responsible for becoming a doctor, you're going to be fine. That's my final thing to say. And yeah, that's how my interviews went and the details within those interviews. So I really hope you found that useful, and best of luck for any interviews that you may have, or for anything that you have based on your application process. Yeah, I'll see you guys very soon. If you have any more specific questions, leave them down below in the comments, or if you want, you can email me at this email right here. It's in the description as well for more personal questions. But remember that I do get a lot of emails, especially nowadays because of interviews and whatever, so it might take some time for me to reply, and yeah, just warning you. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. I wish you guys all the best. This is a really stressful time. I think this was probably the most stressful time, this whole application process. But one thing I can say from personal experience is that the interviews are better than the UCAT. That's one thing I can say. Okay, so just remember that much, that the interviews are better than UCAT, apart from the Cambridge interview. The Cambridge interview was the worst thing of my life, but that's okay. We can leave that for a different video. You don't have to worry about that one. But generally, now you've gone past the UCAT, this part should be a breeze. Not really a breeze, but this should be, if you do everything you can, then you don't need to worry. That's what I'm trying to say. And yeah, good luck with the rest of your application process. It's a long process, but it's one that will finish eventually, and you will eventually have things work out for you. And I need to do my own revision because I'm weeks behind, but it's all right. This is uni life. You kind of have to enjoy it, right? So I hope you guys enjoyed. I have been slowing down on uploads recently, but I will be trying my best of efforts to keep it up and at least upload like a few times a month if I can. But it's really becoming so much worse nowadays. I've said this way too many times, but genuinely, best of luck. I wish you the best. Don't lose focus, and hopefully I see a few of you guys come to UCL with me. That would be nice. And yeah, bye.